The 86-year-old Bonnie Carey Spillway's state-of-the-art design at its early 20th century opening stands the test of time, but progress often has a cost. DeCondra Norwood looks back at the history of the community lost in flooded history.
A marvel of engineering. The Bonnie Carey Spillway sits about 30 miles north of the heart of New Orleans on the Mississippi River in St. Charles Parish.
The land usage was good, so from an engineering perspective,
there were 2 crevasses or breaks in the levee near the area in the late 19th century.
They could capture that portion of the river and manage the spillway between here and Lake Pontchartrain.
A place in the winding path of the Big Muddy where nature was already trying to break free.
Many are familiar with the rushing waters protecting lands downstream, but the land that we stand on right now holds a hidden history.
Even after those massive floods, Mont's was a thriving community.
A lot of the whole area was in use, yes, till it became a spillway.
The tract of land, now periodically flooded, once housed at least 4 plantations, even well after the Civil War. Many of the formerly enslaved still worked the land where they had been born, lived, and died.
It's the Roseland Plantation, the Pierre Ross Hermitage Plantation, who toiled on this land, and that's how I really came to the conclusion and realization that my great-great-great-grandfather was buried here.
Christopher Smothers' journey into his family history led him to the United States National Archives.
I didn't even know the records existed.
Following the stories of his 86-year-old grandmother, he took a chance and discovered a treasure.
John Brown was the father of Douglas Brown. He was born approximately 1835.
He was a soldier in the United States Colored Troops, fighting with the Union Army for the promise of freedom.
Fortunately and courageously, my ancestor John Brown and many other relatives felt that this was their opportunity to attain liberty.
These Civil War veterans' stories detailed in affidavits from the soldiers, their widows, and friends in pursuit of their rightful military pensions.
It's very emotional. You can interpret the pain in their words, how they really, really suffered.
The hundreds of pages of written accounts lead back to this land. In a deposition from March 1903, Lydia Brown says, "I am the widow of John Brown, who served in the Union Army about 3 years. The soldier and I were slaves of Pierre Ross and lived before the war at the Ross place. After the soldier was mustered, he came to the Ross place again, and we lived as husband and wife until he died. Pierre Ross consolidated the plantations in the area. Some land was eventually sold to the Kugler family. On the National Register of Historic Places, that name identifies one of the 2 known burial grounds marked only by a boundary of white metallic strips in the floodplain."
The oral accounts tell us that there were markers in this area. I don't have a sense of the way they were, all the markers were aligned.
The other is labeled Kenner, after its last landowner.
Here would be the burying ground for what we understand to have been the enslaved community at the time, starting during the antebellum period and continuing through the life of the plantation.
There are accounts of burials right up until the time the federal government started work on the spillway in 1929.
Not making any apologies for it. The world was a different place in 1929.
The living were displaced, but the graves remained. Through the Bonnie Carey's 1935 dedication as the first flood control project completed in the post-1927 mission to tame the Mississippi. A carnival-like celebration with President Franklin Roosevelt visiting in 1937, the same year of the structure's first opening, likely spreading the first layer of alluvial soil that began the cemetery's erasure from this landscape.
Yeah, many years spent trying to find that narrative, trying to find answers for my grandmothers. They were really robbed of a lot. It's kind of like, not only did it kind of help me build a connection to them, but it really gave them closure for a lot of the injustices they witnessed in their youth.
These are field rows. What we're doing now, which is protecting and maintaining the areas, and then there's a preservation in place plan.
It's part of archaeologist Jason Emery's job to manage the effects of the United States Corps of Engineers operations on cultural and historical resources in this region.
We do monitoring of the cemeteries after operation to ensure that there's no additional damage.
In recent years, after the floodwaters subside, a team of archaeologists and Corps personnel inspect these properties to make sure the water didn't disturb the graves. But for 40 years, the sacred ground had not been treated as such.
There was a 1975 discovery of human remains along this corridor.
Human bones, artifacts such as an Oddfellow Society crest and a stone fragment that appears to be part of a military headstone of a U.S. colored troop veteran, were unearthed in the eastern plot known as the Kenner Cemetery. That led to an extensive archaeological survey in 1986. In 2012, the Corps held public meetings contacting descendants of what they believed to be anywhere from 150 to 300 people buried in the known areas.
The 1975 human remains are scheduled for a reinterment as we move towards a master plan and reinterpretation.
These are people's ancestors, whether they know it or not.
The Corps revealed a plan to create a space honoring the lives once lived here as part of a grand plan for the spillway. Nearly 10 years after that public input, the cemeteries are still nondescript plots in a vast field, and those disinterred remains remain in storage.
There needs to be an official landmark designating the sacredness of this area.
Part of that effort with the master planning started in 2010, so we're 10 years down the road from that. I think what I understand is that there's some legal challenges associated with our authority to be able to do some of the things that we'd proposed, but honestly, I don't know the answers to that. In the end, we can get back to you on that. I think, and I support it.
There are lives here, people who sacrificed their lives here.
The people buried in these now unmarked graves sacrificed their strength to produce the sugar that fueled this economy long before the oil.
They have names, and they should be honored, as with any other person of value.
They sacrificed years away from loved ones to fight with the Union Army in the Civil War.
And there should be a collective effort to try and honor them and recognize them.
And now they sacrifice their final resting place to the swirling waters of the overflowing Mississippi. Nikandra Norwood, Fox 8, Local First.
As to why there's been no movement on the 2012 plan for reinterment and redesign of the grave sites, a Corps of Engineers spokesperson said the Bonnie Carey Master Plan is a long-term guide for future management and advancement of the spillway's recreational, natural, and cultural resources. The currently proposed master plan includes new features that require additional authority and funding before it can be finalized for implementation.
On Louisiana's historic River Road, there are at least a dozen plantations, including the Whitney Plantation. It's a museum dedicated to sharing the accounts of slavery told from the perspective of enslaved people, including children. Just 50 miles outside of New Orleans, we get a closer look at a dark time in America's history.
At its peak, this plantation encompassed about 1,700 acres.
A sugarcane plantation that is now a museum. It gives a real and raw account of slavery from the perspective of people who endured this brutal system.
The lifespan of an enslaved person who worked in the fields was 7 to 10 years. So that gives you some idea of the brutality and the labor required.
Dr. Joy Banner's connection to this plantation runs deep.
I am a descendant of the enslaved people and the enslaving family that were at this plantation.
Her roots grounded here, but now she's flipped the narrative and serves as the communication director for the plantation.
In a strange way, it's an outlet, right? And it's allowed me to delve into the history in a way that I never did before.
And every year, thousands of people visit Whitney, hungry to hear the truth of their history. Visitors can stop by actual slave cabins. They also get a look at the jail, similar to the pens used at auction houses.
Seeing, the experience has really, I would say it has been a game changer for me, right? Because now it's more than just books. It's an experience that, I have walked through.
I've learned that what was done to Black people back in those times was intentional and deliberate, and that the people who did these things really had no morals. They really loved money over, people, and it was just atrocious.
A history that's not often taught in the classroom. A history being challenged right now.
A lot of people don't talk about it, and they talk about the problems like now, but a lot of people don't really look back on the history. I feel like in most history classes they more teach about like presidents. I feel like this is more like what you should teach than presidents, because it's a really big part of history.
A painful history, and in some ways the impacts still felt today.
Do people know the experience? And maybe this Juneteenth could be an opportunity for people to study about what did race look like in their respective areas. So not just on plantation grounds, but wherever you are in this country.
There are 4 memorials on this plantation, including this one dedicated to the men and women killed in the 1811 Louisiana slave revolt. It's documented as one of the largest uprisings of enslaved people in the United States. At the Whitney Plantation, I'm Jamise Price for BNC.
For more than 4 decades, the magnificent Owens-Thomas Mansion on Savannah's Oglethorpe Square was home to a succession of wealthy white families, as well as a varying number of enslaved African Americans who tended to their every need. The day-to-day experience of these individuals differed greatly from the plantation slavery portrayed in popular movies and books.
The labor of those that worked in homes like the Owens-Thomas house was 24-hour labor. They rarely got much sleep because they had to be on call 24 hours a day.
We really have to remember that for enslaved people, being in the house was not pleasant. It was a job, and it was a job constantly under the thumb of the employers.
And it all happened here. These roughly finished rooms that hardly changed in the past century and a half represent one of the few intact slave quarters and workspaces in existence in America today. Historians Leslie M. Harris and Dinah Ramey Berry have conducted groundbreaking research into the lives of the slaves who lived and worked in this one-of-a-kind space.
We're very lucky to have the Owens-Thomas house. It was so well preserved. To have the urban slave quarters is a pretty rare thing.
For decades, these historic spaces were overlooked and overshadowed by the ornate rooms upstairs. But that neglect was actually a blessing, creating an architectural time capsule that preserved secrets for historians to uncover.
The basement of the Owens-Thomas house is a unique space, interestingly, because for some years it was neglected. As a result of that, the plasterwork, the floors, the ceilings, they weren't constantly updated and maintained in the way the ones upstairs would have been. That can seem like a bad thing, but in this case, it allows us to have the original plaster, the original stones on the floors that can really give us evidence that helps us answer questions about how people lived and worked in these spaces.
The Telfair's Owens-Thomas House Museum has decided to expand its focus to tell the story of all the people who made this house their home, adding their narrative to the story of the wealthy whites who lived in relative comfort upstairs.
This house still has so many stories to tell.
We're telling stories of people who in some ways have been forgotten by history. And it's an honor for us to be able to take the opportunity to introduce them to the public and bring their stories back to light.
From before dawn until well after sundown, enslaved people performed difficult, complex tasks to keep the house running. Well-documented research has revealed that a skilled cook named Diane worked here for years, preparing complicated meals for up to 20 people or more.
Diane is not just a cook. And when you think about just a cook, you have to think about what that means. What does it mean in the 19th century to prepare food in a space like this with the type of utensils and equipment that we don't have, like toaster ovens and microwaves and ways to heat up food fast. You know, I think our conception of that is very different today than it was for someone like Diane, who had to spend almost all of her waking hours preparing food and serving this family.
We can look at the Owens-Thomas house and see all of the places where enslaved people put things in place, made sure the house was running efficiently. These were all very highly skilled jobs that enslaved people performed throughout their lives.
We also know that Diane may have served or cooked for President Polk. So these are the kinds of guests that were in this house. We're not just talking about a Savannah citizen, we're also talking about important dignitaries and guests. And so they're cooking food for some of the most important citizens of Savannah and of the United States.
In a nearby room, other enslaved workers worked to clean the mansion's laundry, a dangerous and exhausting task.
Doing laundry in the 19th century was laborious work, and it was dangerous because you're working with not only boiling water, but also chemicals such as lye, which could damage the skin. The people that were doing this work were probably young girls that were being trained. They were probably, under 14 years of age, and they were working with older women who taught them how to do this labor, which was very, very labor-intensive and dangerous.
We're removing the chimney cap to access the flues from up here on the roof.
Reinterpreting this basement space coincides with an opportunity to utilize best practices in the field of historic preservation throughout the house. The experts started with the HVAC system.
The most obvious thing that needed to be addressed was the air conditioning equipment that ran through the basement. There was ductwork running throughout the basement. It's all insulated with silver insulation. It's a real visual impediment to the space.
Modern HVAC ducts were removed from the basement and a completely customized system was routed through the 2-century-old chimneys. This process has only been performed in a few other locations in the world.
You pulling?
I'm pulling.
All right, cool.
While difficult to install, it provides temperature and humidity control without disrupting the historic fabric of the house.
No, we got it.
You got it? All right.
All right.
Good job.
Fantastic.
Crumbling plaster ceilings and walls are stabilized, leaving as much of the original plaster as possible.
These walls contain so much history that's yet to be discovered. We want to keep that intact.
It's a super slow, tedious process. I could sit here and brush all day.
Glass floors are installed to give visitors an up-close look at one of the first indoor plumbing systems in the nation.
One of the things that makes the Owens-Thomas house absolutely unique is that in 1819, when it was completed, it had indoor plumbing on all 3 levels. That includes bathing chambers with showers and bathtubs, as well as flush water closets and sinks. In the past, visitors haven't really been able to experience that in an up-close personal way. Today, visitors can walk into the bathing chamber and the cistern on newly installed glass floors, and they can experience those spaces and get a sense of how they functioned in time.
And in this space that stayed unchanged for so long, state-of-the-art restoration and new exhibits tell stories and ask challenging questions about life in Savannah before the end of the Civil War.
What's different about the Owens-Thomas house is that visitors will leave here knowing about specific enslaved people and how they contributed to the functioning of the house. They're not just learning about the architecture and the furniture and the paintings on the walls. They're learning about people, and not just the owners of the house, but those that helped make the house function.
History, preservation, and exhibits come together to tell a more complete story of this historic house and the people, black and white, free and enslaved, who called it home.
History didn't stop in 1840 when we interpret our house. It's still happening. And I think we're still grappling with issues that grew out of slavery. And until we get to the historical root of all those issues, we're never going to move beyond them.
The history of slavery matters today because it shaped the way we interact with one another. It informs our racial climate of today. So this history is extremely important.
Understanding that is to understand a huge part of our history in this nation. And places like the Owens-Thomas house can be a place where we can begin to understand that terrible history and then hopefully move forward from it.
What makes the Owens-Thomas house special is that they're telling stories, very detailed stories about what enslaved people did in this house. And the Owens-Thomas house is the perfect space to do this because we need to understand American history in its fullest. And I think for a long time, we've studied American history and ignored groups of people like African-American enslaved people. And we haven't really recognized their contributions to urban centers like Savannah. So I think this is a time for us to learn this whole history so that our children and their children and their children will understand all the contributions to the United States.
It's a very complex story. It's a pretty amazing story. And we're really lucky to have this site to tell that story through.
In this world, we walk a fine line between history and memory, between acknowledgement and erasure. As a Black person in America, the weight of our ancestors' struggles is palpable, an undeniable tether to a past that refuses to be silenced. The histories of our people, often obscured and buried beneath layers of neglect and ignorance, urge us to confront the discomforting truth of our collective legacy. The narratives surrounding unmarked slave cemeteries, submerged in the Bonnet Carré spillway, the urban slavery witnessed at the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters, and the tribute to our ancestors preserved in the Whitney Plantation Museum unveil the profound injustices that have shaped our lives today. To begin with, one cannot overlook the tragic truth of the unmarked slave cemeteries lying underwater in the Bonnet Carré spillway, silently serving as a graveyard for the souls whose lives were defined by exploitation and dehumanization. These sites serve as a chilling reminder that our ancestors were often stripped of their identities, their contributions erased in the very soil that cradles their remains. Their stories, buried and forgotten, represent countless lives lost, families torn apart, and dreams deferred. The water may cover their resting places, but it cannot drown their legacy nor the pain that lingers in our bones. We must confront the reality that these ancestors, who toiled relentlessly under the weight of oppression, deserve remembrance. We owe it to them to ensure that their stories emerge from the depths of the past, no longer submerged and silent. Next, consider the urban slavery that existed at places like the Owens Thomas House and slave quarters. These physical structures stand as remnants of an era that many would prefer to forget, but we cannot allow ourselves the luxury of ignorance. Here, Black bodies were commodified, treated as property rather than individuals. The very walls that house the wealth of a few were built on the backs of countless enslaved people who labored tirelessly and were denied their humanity. Urban slavery presents a unique narrative that emphasizes the pervasive nature of this inhumane system, reminding us that the shadows of slavery stretch far beyond the plantations. The echoes of our ancestors resonate through the streets that they walked, and their stories need to be told. We must demand that these histories are not only acknowledged, but also taught, understood, and honored. Lastly, the Whitney Plantation Museum stands as a beacon of hope in the face of our tragic history. Dedicated to sharing the accounts of slavery, it invites all who enter to confront the brutal truths of our past. This sanctuary for our ancestors' stories is not merely a museum, but a place of remembrance and healing. It offers a space where the narratives of those who were once rendered voiceless can be amplified. At the Whitney Plantation, we can engage in the essential work of acknowledging our past and recognizing how it informs our present. It reminds us that we are part of a continuum, a legacy built on resilience, resistance, and the unwavering spirit of those who came before us. Nevertheless, the struggle continues. We live in a society that often seeks to downplay or erase the very narratives we need to hear. The stories of our ancestors, those who fought, survived, and endured, are essential for understanding the systems of oppression that persist today. The unmarked graves and the echoes of urban slavery urge us to rise, to refuse to be mere spectators of history, and to actively participate in the reclamation of our narrative. To deny our past is to deny our identity. We must confront the reality of what it means to be Black in America, to honor the pain and the struggle while celebrating the strength and resilience that defines our existence. In seeking the truth of our history, we find a path toward healing, empowerment, and ultimately, justice. Thus, we must amplify these stories, ensuring that the memory of our ancestors remains an indelible part of who we are and who we aspire to be. Only then can we begin to build a future where all of our histories are acknowledged, respected, and honored. In solidarity with our ancestors and each other, let us commit ourselves to this essential work. As we confront the uncomfortable truths of our past, we forge a deeper connection to our identity and pave the way for generations yet to come. The struggle for recognition, justice, and healing does not end with acknowledgement. It is a continuous journey that demands our unwavering dedication. Together, we stand resolute in the face of history, lifting each other up as we navigate the complexities of our shared experience. Our voices are powerful, and through them, the legacies of our ancestors will never be forgotten.